Namaskar. The early Aryans, T.Burrow. The classical civilization of India developed from the earlier Vedic civilization, and the Vedic civilization was the creation of the Aryans, an invading people whose first arrival in the subcontinent is probably to be dated about 1500 BC. Perhaps some 200 years after this estimated date, there began to come into being a collection of religious hymns which were eventually organized as the Rig Veda, the final redaction of which probably antedates 1000 BC. Our knowledge of the Aryans in India during this earliest period is based primarily on this work. From the Rig Veda in emerges a fairly clear picture of the situation of that time. A series of related tribes settled mainly in the Punjab and adjacent regions, speaking a common language, sharing a reason, common religion, and designating themselves by the name Arya are are represented as being in a state of permanent conflict with a hostile group of people known variously as Das or the Sioux. From the frequent references to these conflicts, it emerges that their result was the complete victory of the Aryans. During the period represented by the later Samhitas and the Brahma, Brahman texts, the Aryans are seen to have extended their territory principally in the direction of the east down the Ganga Valley, and references to conflict with the Dasa are rare. Other terms, for example, Mleksha and Nishad, are used as designations of non-Aryan tribes, while the word Dasa becomes the usual word for slave. On the other hand, the term Arya is opposed not only to the external barbarian but also to the lowest of the four castes, the Sudra. In the later context, the word Arya naturally acquires the meaning noble, honorable, and the word continues in use in both senses down to the classical period. North India is referred to as Aryavart, the country where the Aryans lived, or the in Pali as Aryam Ayatanam. Ayatanam. The Jaina texts have frequent references to the distinction between Arya and Mleksha. In Tamil literature, the kings of North India are referred to as kings. On the other hand, the ethical use of the word is illustrated by the Buddhist noble eightfold part, Ariyam Athangikam Maggam, where the word has no ethnic significance. The Aryans, whose presence in northwestern India is documented by the Rigveda, has reached the territory they then occupied through a migration, or rather a succession of migrations from outside the Indian subcontinent. The final stage of this migration cannot have been very far removed from the beginning of the composition of the Rigveda, but at the same time a sufficient period of time must have elapsed for any clear recollection of it to have disappeared, since the hymns contain no certain references to such an event. The Aryan invasion of India is recorded in no written document, and it cannot yet be traced archaeologically, but it is nevertheless finally established as a historical fact on the basis of comparative philology. The Indo-European languages, of which Sanskrit in its Vedic form is one of the oldest members, originated in Europe, and the only possible way why a language belonging to this family could be carried all the way to India was a migration of the people speaking it. It has been observed that the Aryan invasion of India seems to have taken place some considerable time before the composition of the Vedic hymns, since no clear recollection of this migration is to be found in them. On the other hand, references are frequent to the struggle with the previous inhabitants, the Das or the Sioux, and to the occupation of their land and the capture of their possessions. As to the identity of these people who were displaced or subjugated, the predominant and most likely view is that they were the author of the Indus civilization. This civilization, which was quite unexpected when it was first discovered, was certainly earlier than the Vedic period, but there has been some argument as to whether it fall of its fall was brought about by the invading Aryans, or whether some period of time elapsed between the end of the Indus civilization and the appearance of the Aryans. The evidence of the Vedic texts themselves is decidedly in favor of the former view, notably on account of the frequent references to the destruction of cities, the war god Indra, uh, Indra being known as Purandar, destroyer of cities. Agni, the fire god, is also prominently mentioned in this capacity, understandably, since many of the Indus cities appear to have been destroyed by fire. In view of these repeated references, the conclusion seems inescapable that the destruction of the Indus cities was the work of the Aryans. It is clear from the material remains that the Indus civilization was, in certain respects, superior to that of the Aryan. In particular, it was a city civilization of the highly developed type, while by contrast, city life was unfamiliar to the Aryans. The superiority of the Aryans lay in the military field, in which their use of the light horse chariot played a prominent part. Their victory resulted in the almost complete abandonment of the cities. In much same was the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain put an end to the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain put an end to British city life. Not only did the Aryans have no interest in using the cities they conquered, but also they lacked the technical ability to keep them going. The Aryans built their settlement of wood, and they were distributed in small units, villages rather than towns. During most of the Vedic period, since their houses and furniture were made mainly of wood and other perishable materials, not much has remained for the archaeologists to record, and until very recently, the Vedic period in India remained archaeologically almost a complete blank. Even now, the position has not advanced far beyond this. It was only towards the end of the Vedic period that the development of cities was resumed, resumed. Whereas for the Indus civilization, archaeology is the only source for our knowledge. Information concerning the Vedic Aryans depends entirely on literary texts which were handed down by oral tradition. These do not provide any proper historical account, since that is not their concern, but a good deal of incidental information of a historical or semi-historical character emerges, and also a fairly clear and consistent picture of the life and civilization of the period. It is a much discussed question as to what extent the Indus civilization influenced the Aryans, and opinion on this matter have considerably diverged. On the whole, the Vedic texts themselves give the impression that such influence, if it existed, was not of great importance. The territory occupied by the Aryans at the time of the Rig Veda can be defined with reference to the river names mentioned in the text. These are, in the first place, the Indus, Sindhu and its main tributaries, the five rivers of the Punjab. To the west of this, there is mention of the Kumu, Gomti and Kuha, the Kurram, Gomal and Kabul rivers of the Suvastu, Swat, showing that the Aryans extended to within the boundaries of present Afghanistan. To the east the Sravasti, the Darsh, Darshadwati, and Yamuna are in Aryan territory, and the Ganga is mentioned in one late hymns. Most of this territory had lain within the sphere of the Indus civilization. On the other hand, little is heard of the region of the lower Indus where that civilization had equally flourished. The Aryans were divided into a large number of independent tribes, normally ruled by king who, when not fighting the Dasas or the Sioux, were frequently engaged in fighting each other. Nevertheless, the Aryans were highly conscious of their ethnic unity based on a common language, a common religion, and a common way of life, and on the contrast between themselves and earlier inhabitations. The latter were partly absorbed into the Aryan community in the capacity of Sudras, and partly they withdrew the regions temporarily out of the reach of the Aryans. The fact that the Aryans were able to retain their identity and maintain their culture so completely in a country which had previously been both well populated and highly civilized implies that they must have come in great numbers, not in one campaign of conquest, but in a series of waves lasting over a long period, sufficient to provide a numerous population which in turn could form the basis of further expansion. This situation was just the opposite of that which prevailed in the Near East, where conquest effected by small bands of warriors resulted in temporary domination, but where their numbers were too small to prevent their absorption after a few generations into the native population. The area occupied by the Aryans continued to expand in the period represented by the later Vedic text, and there was a shift eastward in the center of gravity. By the time of the Brahmanas, the center of Aryan civilization has the country the country of the Kurus and Panchals, corresponding roughly to modern Uttar Pradesh, while the western settlement in the Punjab were less important. Further expansion to the east had taken place, and the most important states in in this region were Kushal, Kasi, and Videha. The main Aryan advance at this period was down the Ganga Valley, keeping primarily to the north of the river. It is likely that the main route of migration followed the foothills of the Himalaya, avoiding in the first instance the densely forested country surrounding the river itself. By far the greater number of tribes and kingdoms mentioned in the text of this period lay to the north of the Ganga. Those lying to the south, for example, the Sedis, the the Satvans, Sat, Satvans, and the kingdom of Bidhar were much fewer and more rarely mentioned. The Aryans were at this time surrounded by a variety of non-Aryan tribes, of which a list is provided by the Aitareya Brahmana: Andhras, Pundras, Mutivas, Pulindas, and Savras. The countries of the countries of Ang and Magad appear from the source to have been only partially Aryanized. In the Rig Veda, the conflict between Arya and the Sioux figured prominently, reflecting, as we have seen, a prolonged armed struggle in which the Aryans finally emerged as the undisputed victors. Such references ceased in the later Vedic literature, and the term the Sioux, as applied to non-Aryan people, is comparatively rare. On the other hand, the term Nisad applied to primitive forest dwellers is comparatively frequent. The explanation is that the nature of the Aryan advance and settlement has changed. Once the Indus civilization has been overthrown and the greater part of its territory occupied, there remain no advanced civilized states to contend with. The Ganga Valley seems at this time to have been thinly populated by forest tribes, possessing no advanced civilization and unable to offer any coherent resistance to the Aryans. The colonization that took place down the valley, the first principally to the north of the river, was mainly a matter of clearing forest and founding agricultural settlements, a continuous and prolonged process extending over centuries. In the uncleared forest region, the primitive tribes of Nisadas continue to reside in the midst, midst of Aryan territory, and relations between the two seems to have been established on the basis of mutual toleration. Naturally, as the activity of forest clearing proceeded, the scope of the independent existence of the forest tribe became more limited, and sections of them under such names as Pukasa and Chandala attached themselves to the fringe of Aryan society, forming the nucleus of what were to become eventually the depressed class. The third stage in the Aryan occupation of India fall within the period 800 to 500 BC. It has been observed that at the beginning of this period, according to the evidence of the Brahmanas, the portion of India occupied by the Aryans was still comparatively limited, and that they were surrounded by a ring of non-Aryan peoples, some of whose names are mentioned. A very much wider extension of Aryan language and culture can be observed at the time of the rise of Buddhism and Jainism towards the end of the 6th century BC. Obviously, the intervening period has been one of extensive migration and colonization. The result was that the boundaries of Aryavarth, the countries of the Aryans, were defined as the Himalaya and Vindhya mountains to the north and south, and the eastern and western oceans. One of the main lines of expansion at this time lay to the southwest, embracing Avanti and adjacent regions, and extending as far as Asmaka and Maluka in the region of the upper Godavari. The advance to the east continued with the occupation of the greater part of Bengal, Pundra, Pundra Sohma, Banga, etc., and Odisha, Kalinga. The areas, the areas to the south of Ganga, the areas to the south of the Ganga, connecting those, connecting these two lines of advance were also progressively brought within the Aryan fold. References to these events can be found scattered throughout the epics and Puranas, of which it will be sufficient to mention and foundation of Dwarka on the west coast ascribed to Krishna, and the activities of the Haihayas and allied tribes in Avanti. The overall result was that by the end of the 6th century BC, the portion of India occupied by Aryans was vastly increased, and the currency of the Indo-Aryan language was correspondingly extended. A map representing the extent of the Aryan occupation at the end of this period would probably show a general correspondence with the boundaries of Indo-Aryan in a modern linguistic map. After this, Aryan influence further south in the Dravidian India was a matter of cultural penetration, not as previously of conquest and settlement. Settlement during the Brahmana period, the Aryans mentioned is essentials in their ethnic identity and their Vedic culture. There was considerable internal development, and in particular, the Brahmins increased their status and strengthened their organization. The ritual were enormously developed, and the text on which we depend for a picture of the period are mainly concerned with this. This state organization was stabilized and developed, and a variety of offices are recorded, even though their precise functions are not always clear. The political units became larger and the state began to replace the tribe. There, there were considerable advances in material culture as attested by both literature and archaeology. City life began again in a small way, since a number of places mentioned, for example, Kampil, Pari, Parichakra, Ascendivant, Ascendivant, appear to have been towns rather than villages. The rapid expansion during the 800 to 550 BC period had the result that in the new territories the Aryans were much more thinly spread than in the old, and they were to a greater extent mixed with the pre-existing population. This fact is noted in some ancient texts. For instance, uh, the Bodhayan Dharma Sutra says that the people of Avanti, Ang, Magadha, Su- Saurashtra, Dakshinapath, Upabrat, Sindhu, and Sobir are of mixed origin. Sanki, Sankirna Yoni, and further lays down an offering of atonement of those who visit the countries of the Aratas and Karaskaras, the Pundras and Soviras, the the Vangas, the Kalingas, and the uh, Pranunas. These lists cover a large part of the territories colonized during the period 800 to 500 BC and attest to the fact that these territories were only imperfectly Aryanized in contrast to what has happened in the earlier period. The list also contain the names of a number of non-Aryan tribes, many of which still no doubt retained their identity and language. The influence of the pre-Aryan and Aryan culture should probably be regarded as having begun to take effect during this period, and it is associated with the transition from the Vedic civilization to the later Hindu civilization. This was probably also the time when the epic traditions, later to culminate in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, began to take shape. New developments in religion, which eventually evolved into the later Hinduism, which contrast in many ways with the Vedic religion, had Vedic religion also had their first beginnings in this period. The great increase in the complexity of the caste system, which characterizes later Hindu civilization, was also stimulated at this time by the necessity of somehow fitting into the framework of Aryan society. A large variety of previously independent tribes, who in many parts of the newly conquered area must have formed the majority of the population. The Aryan culture, based on the Vedic culture, remained the centralizing factor, but from now on it was more subject to non-Aryan influences. The influence of Aryan civilization was felt latest in the Dravidian South. The first Aryan colonization of Ceylon is supposed to have taken place about the time of the Buddha, and the earliest Aryan penetration in South India is likely to have occurred about the same time. Later, the Maurya Empire was in control of most of the Deccan. Only the Tamil princes of the extreme south remaining independent. The Satvahana Empire, which followed, also represented Aryan domination and penetration in this region, as can be seen from the fact that the official language of this dynasty and of some of its immediate successor was Middle Indo-Aryan. This political influence was associated with the spread of religions from North India, both Brahminical and Buddhist or Jain. In contrast, however, to the previous states of expansion, the Aryan language was not permanently imposed on this region, and after about 500 AD, Kannada and later Telugu began to be used in inscriptions. Gradually, the native Dravidian element gained the upper hand, and the boundaries between Aryan and Dravidian India was restored to a line representing the limit of Aryan conquest about 500 BC. At the same time, the whole subcontinent was united by a common culture of which the Aryans were the original founders, but to which the Dravidians and others also made their contributions. Thank you.